Please be seated. So before I begin our proclamation, I'm going to do a little teaching piece, and then I'm going to proclaim the gospel through the good news of our sermon, and then I'm going to finish the sermon and talk a little bit about the TEEM program, because that's part of the reason that I'm here today. And so you'll notice Pastor Mark is wearing a stole that goes over his shoulders. That is the symbol of his office and ordination to word and sacrament as a pastor. My stole, you'll notice, goes across my body, and that is the symbol of my ordination into the office of word and service as a deacon. And even our stole signifies the work that we do where we are the bridge where the church meets the world. And so deacons who are ordained in word and service connect your time on Sunday mornings to what happens to you and the world starting on Monday. And so we help you make those connectors. So we can be called to a congregation, we can be called to a parachurch organization. My call is to theological education at United Lutheran Seminary. And so I do not serve a church proper congregation itself. That's not my calling. It also gives me the freedom to be able to come out and be at a variety of different settings, like your lovely church here at Holy Trinity in Wildwood. And so I'm super thankful that this is my call as a deacon in the ELCA. So just a little signifier. This is the symbol of my office of word and service, and that is Pastor Mark's symbol of the office of word and sacrament. Our gospel lesson today is a familiar story of the Samaritan, or the Good Samaritan. And many of us have heard this time and time again. It comes up every 3 years in the lectionary cycle, so every 3 years we're talking about the Good Samaritan at some point. And we get complacent when we're familiar with a story. I know what the story says. I know exactly what the story says. I know exactly what the story is telling us as followers of Jesus. And so I'm going to kind of shut down and not listen. And that's our temptation, right? It's the same in our families when we hear the same story again and again and again and again. We tend to stop listening to that story. The story of the Good Samaritan is a favorite of mine because it's yet another example of Jesus pushing us to pay attention to justice. Jesus was a radical. Jesus turned everything upside down, absolutely everything, even tables in the temple courtyard. Jesus turned everything upside down. And that's exactly what he's doing in the story of the Samaritan. Now, the priest and the Levite, those two dudes get a bad reputation in this story and are often looked down upon because they did not help this poor, bleeding man. Well, that's not okay to look down upon the priest and the Levite, because the priest and the Levite were called to stay clean. And there were in Jewish codes, there's all of these cleanliness codes. And so priests are supposed to stay clean. And if they become unclean, they have to go through all of these rituals to become clean again. And so was that priest heading on to his community to help lead them in prayer or worship or Torah reading? Most likely, yes. And so if he had stopped to help this bleeding man, he would have become unclean and not been able to proclaim the Torah portion for that day, perhaps. The same is true for the Levite. A Levite is a descendant from the tribe of Levi, the 12 tribes of Abraham. Look back on that in the Old Testament. The Levite tribe, the tribe of Levi, was tasked most specifically with the care of the temple portion called the holiest of holies. So in the temple, there was the gathering portico outside, and then there was the gathering space inside, and then there was the place for women and others, and then there was the place for men inside of that. And then inside of that was the place called the Holy of Holies, and that's where God lived. Our Jewish siblings believed that that's where God was living, was in the Holy of Holies place within inside the temple. So this was a highly sacred location in the temple. And so you needed to be pure and clean to trim the wicks, put oil in the lamps, dust off the altar, make sure it's clean, because this is the holiest place of all, the most sacred of places. And so Levites needed to stay clean in order to tend to the holiest of holy places. And so the Levite was probably heading to the temple for his shift to care for the holiest of holies. So if he had stopped to take care of that bleeding man, he would have remained unclean. Now, Leviticus and the tribe of Levi has 613 holiness codes or cleanliness codes, 613 that they had to keep in order to be able to go into the holiest of holies. And if you break one of those cleanliness codes, you have to go through this massive ritual of cleanliness that takes many days. So the Levite passed on by because the Levite had a responsibility to his task that he had been given. Now, those holiness codes only pertain to those who are of the tribe of Levi, okay? And so for many centuries, people have tried to follow the Leviticus holiness codes, and we even pull some of those out even today and point to them and say, it says in the Bible this. Is there anybody here that is a descendant of the tribe of Levi? Anyone know that? None of us know this. None of us know this. That's centuries ago. It's hard enough to track our own lineage outside of the United States sometimes, let alone all the way centuries back to Levites. And so those holiness codes don't pertain to us. They only pertain to Levites who were taking care of the holiest of holies. So the priest and the Levite could not help this bleeding man because the holiness codes, a lot of them, the cleanliness stuff had to do with bodily fluids, and blood's a bodily fluid. So here's this bleeding man. The Levite and the priest cannot help this man. And this is where Jesus does the justice thing and flips everything upside down. He talks about a Samaritan. And the Samaritans at that time, the Jews and the Samaritans were the others, the outies, the thems. You know, the us and thems, the we's and the they's. They were the thems, the outies. And so Jesus, in his justice work, his consummate, always doing justice work, uses a Samaritan as an example, which catches the listener's ears. Because why would you talk about a Samaritan? Why would a Samaritan matter? And that's Jesus flipping everything upside down and talking about justice. That a Samaritan that you look down upon, that you label as an outie, is the one that is a neighbor to the hurting man. Jesus is calling us to pay attention to that justice work and that flipping upside down. Because the Jews at that time would have been like, a Samaritan, they're not worth anything. They're the others. In this story, we are reminded that we need to flip our answers and ask the question, where am I living justice in this situation, in this scenario? Jesus tells the man to think about who is your neighbor. Moving neighbor from an object to a subject. And a subject is a relationship, right? An object is a thing. A subject is a relationship. And so Jesus is saying the Samaritan was the one that was in relationship with a man who was hurting. We're supposed to do the same thing. Now, I'm not going to go into politics, but I will tell you the gospel is political. Because politics is about how do we live together as a society. That's what politics is. And that's what Jesus does. Jesus is trying to help us understand how to live together as a society. And so who is our neighbor? And how do we care for our neighbor? As a nation, we're really sick right now. Because our neighbors are being hurt in a whole variety of ways. Our neighbors are being arrested and put into detention centers without any due process. This is the flipping of the script that Jesus is calling us to think about. Jesus questions our answers. And so in this familiar story, where are we being called to flip the justice so that the justice is caring for our neighbor, not just those that we want to be our neighbors, but all people? Because in God's eyes, every single person is exactly the same, equally loved, equally valued, equally treasured. And so again, in this familiar story, how are you going to be flipping so that the justice that Jesus is calling us to is happening when you leave this space and go out into the world and live out into the world? We are fed at this table so that we can be strengthened in that love of God to go out and share that love. So ask yourself, who is my neighbor? And make it a person and not an object. And let it enhance the justice and gospel work that you're doing out in this world. And for that flipping, that challenge by Jesus, we give thanks to God. Amen. So I'm here to preach, but also to talk just a little tiny bit about the TEEM program that Ken is in. And we are the ELCA, and we have an acronym for that. ELCA, Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. So TEEM, T-E-E-M, is Theological Education for Emerging Ministries. We're the ELCA, we have an acronym for that. Just like we're the ELCA, we have a form for that as well. And so back in 2003, the ELCA recognized that they had a very narrow path to ordination in word and sacrament ministry, and that not everybody in every situation fit into that very narrow path of a Master's of Divinity to ordination. And so they instituted the TEEM program back in 2003 to allow other people opportunities to enter into ministry and ordination outside of a Master's of Divinity degree. And so that's how the TEEM program got started. And so in TEEM, just like in the regular Masters of Divinity process, there are 2 rails to a train track that Ken the train is going down. Ken the train is going down these train tracks. The one track is the candidacy synod track. And so that's all of his examination process of preparation and suitability for ministry, psychological evaluation, questions and answers, interviews, all of this kind of stuff. That's the candidacy track that is happening with your New Jersey synod out of your bishop's office, okay? And the other rail of this train track is his education and formation, which is what I'm responsible for. And so we have the Certificate in Theological Studies, or CTS, because we're the ELCA, we have an acronym for that. So the Certificate in Theological Studies is 15 classes that meet the requirements of candidacy formation for our TEEM candidates. And so I manage all of that education and formation process for our students at United Lutheran Seminary. Just for reference, a Master's of Divinity 3-credit course is 45 hours of instruction time. So 45 hours face-to-face with a professor. Okay, that's a 3-credit master's level class. Our Certificate in Theological Studies program, CTS, one class is about 22 hours of instruction face-to-face time. Okay, so it's about half of the education requirement of a Master's of Divinity. Now, Ken will tell you that his courses are being taught at a master's level. And I'm going to talk about Ken being a special student in just a minute, so just hang on there. The Certificate in Theological Studies is taught at a master's level even though you're not getting a master's degree. Okay, so that's the TEEM process. At the end of this, there is still a process of approval and then ordination. And Ken will be ordained into the ELCA in word and sacrament, okay? And he'll be able to serve anywhere in the ELCA, but most likely he'll be called to this congregation. That's how the TEEM program works, as leaders are lifted up from within the community, and then they're ordained and continue to serve in that community. When Pastor Mark and I went through, it was, you did your internship at a place, but you never got called to that place. That was a very hard and fast rule for a very long time. And TEEM came in and said, let's change that up a little bit. Now, I said earlier that Ken is a special case. If you haven't realized, Ken is a very special person. And Ken, like me, doesn't do anything the normal way. And I appreciate that about Ken. Ken has decided that he would like to get a Master's of Divinity instead of the Certificate in Theological Studies. So he is going to be taking classes towards his Master's of Divinity in the TEEM program. What's going to happen with Ken is that he's actually going to finish his TEEM requirements before he finishes his master's degree and be able to be ordained when he meets all of those requirements outside of the degree. Other students not in the TEEM program on the traditional route have to wait until they graduate or close to graduation in order to be able to be approved for ordination. And so this is another way for the ELCA to be able to help churches have leaders outside of the norms. So it's very possible that Ken will be ordained before he gets his master's degree. Not a whole lot ahead of time. It might be a year, maybe. It's not going to be like 5 years. But that's one of the different parts of this path that he is taking. That's a lot of information. I am going to be here for the brunch afterwards so that you can ask me questions. You can also find me on the United Lutheran Seminary website. Ken also has my email address. You can send me an email if you have questions. I'm always happy to talk more and explain more because I know it's different and strange. And I want to support the work that is happening in your congregation and in this community. And so if you ever have any questions or need something, don't hesitate to reach out. I am a partner in this journey with Holy Trinity and with Ken. And for that, I give thanks to God. Thank you.